Picture this: a 4-year-old boy in Rutland, Vermont, watching his father board a ship bound for England in 1808, never to return. William Deere, a modest tailor, had received word of a small inheritance waiting across the Atlantic. He kissed his wife Sarah and his 6 children goodbye, promising to return with their fortune. The sea swallowed him whole, and young John Deere would never see his father again. That little boy, raised in crushing poverty by a widowed seamstress mother struggling to keep her family fed, would one day build a $43 billion empire that would literally feed the world. But before the glory, before the billions, before the iconic leaping deer logo became synonymous with American agriculture, there was only poverty, failure, and a desperate gamble in the unforgiving American frontier. John Deere's childhood was defined by absence and scarcity. With his father presumed lost at sea, Sarah Deere worked her fingers raw as a seamstress, stitching together enough money to keep her 6 children from starvation. Young John received only a rudimentary education in Vermont's common schools, the kind of limited schooling available to poor families in early 19th century New England. There were no silver spoons, no trust funds, no safety nets. At 17 years old, in 1821, John made a decision that would set the trajectory of his entire life. He apprenticed himself to Captain Benjamin Lawrence, a successful blacksmith in Middlebury, Vermont. For 4 grueling years, he learned the ancient art of shaping metal with hammer and anvil, developing the calloused hands and sharp eye that would later forge a revolution. The boy who lost his father to the sea would find his fortune in steel. By 1826, at just 22 years old, Deere set up his own blacksmith shop. He married Demarius Lamb in 1827, and together they would have 9 children, mirroring the large family of his youth. For the next 12 years, John Deere moved restlessly around Vermont, setting up smithies in Burlington, Vergennes, and Leicester, desperately trying to make his trade profitable. But competition among blacksmiths was brutal, and the New England economy of the 1830s was collapsing like a house of cards. Shop after shop struggled, clients disappeared, debts mounted. By 1836, facing complete financial ruin and bankruptcy, 32-year-old John Deere stood at a crossroads. Stay in Vermont and drown in poverty, or gamble everything on the unknown frontier. He chose the gamble. Before we continue with this incredible journey from bankruptcy to billions, make sure you're subscribed to Motor Chronicles because we're diving deep into the untold stories of the titans who built the machines that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button and join the thousands who are discovering the dramatic, often tragic origins behind the brands we take for granted. And speaking of our community, drop a comment right now and tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? I want to know if you're tuning in from Iowa farmland, Tokyo skyscrapers, or somewhere completely unexpected. Let's see how global our Motor Chronicles family really is. In 1836, John Deere left his wife and 5 children behind in Vermont, packed his meager belongings, and headed west to Grand Detour, Illinois, following his business associate Leonard Andrus into the unknown. Grand Detour was a tiny frontier settlement on the Rock River, rough and unforgiving, populated by pioneers desperate to tame the wild prairie. Deere arrived essentially broke, carrying nothing but his blacksmithing tools and decades of skill. But the frontier had an insatiable hunger for craftsmen who could fix broken wagon wheels, forge horseshoes, and repair the 1,000 small metal implements that pioneer life demanded. Within months, Deere's reputation as a skilled, reliable blacksmith spread through the settlement. He sent for his family in 1837, finally reuniting them in this raw, muddy outpost that would become the birthplace of an empire. But Grand Detour revealed a problem that was breaking the backs and spirits of every farmer who had dared to settle the American Midwest. The thick, sticky, heavy prairie soil was fundamentally different from the light, sandy soil of New England. Farmers arrived with their traditional cast iron and wooden plows, the same designs their fathers and grandfathers had used successfully back east. But the prairie soil clung to the iron blades like glue, forcing farmers to stop every few feet to scrape off the accumulated muck manually. What should have been productive plowing became torturous, back-breaking labor. Fields that promised abundance delivered only frustration. Thousands of pioneers were literally abandoning their land, defeated not by weather or wild animals, but by dirt itself. The great American agricultural expansion was grinding to a halt because no one could figure out how to make a plow that wouldn't clog. John Deere watched these desperate farmers struggle, and his blacksmith's mind began working on the problem. The exact origin story has several versions, each adding to the mythology, but the core truth remains revolutionary. Some accounts claim Deere remembered the polished needles from his father's tailor shop in Vermont, how smoothly they moved through fabric. Others suggest he observed how a polished steel pitchfork sliced through hay and soil without resistance. Whatever sparked the insight, Deere became convinced of one radical idea. A plow made from highly polished steel, shaped with precision, could scour itself clean as it cut through the prairie soil. The sticky earth would simply slide off the polished surface instead of clinging to rough iron. It was a theory that contradicted conventional wisdom, a gamble that could either solve the prairie problem or confirm Deere as a delusional dreamer. In 1837, in his humble blacksmith shop in Grand Detour, John Deere picked up a discarded broken steel saw blade. The saw was useless for its original purpose, destined for the scrap heap, but Deere saw potential where others saw trash. He heated, hammered, and carefully shaped that salvaged steel into a revolutionary new plow design. The blade was polished to a mirror shine, the curve precisely calculated, the whole implement a radical departure from traditional plow construction. Deere wasn't mass-producing anything yet. He was hand-forging a single experimental prototype, betting his reputation and limited resources on an unproven concept. The farmers who saw him working probably thought he was wasting his time. Cast iron plows had been the standard for generations. Why would a polished steel contraption work any better? In early 1838, John Deere sold his first self-scouring steel plow to a local farmer named Lewis Crandall. The price? Approximately $10. $10 for a tool that would change the course of American agriculture, that would eventually spawn a company worth over $40 billion. Crandall took the strange, shiny plow to his fields, hitched it to his team, and drove it into the stubborn prairie soil. What happened next spread through Grand Detour and the surrounding settlements like wildfire. The plow worked, not just adequately but spectacularly. The polished steel blade sliced through the heavy soil, and the sticky prairie earth slid off the surface cleanly, exactly as Deere had theorized. Crandall didn't need to stop every few feet to scrape. He could plow continuously, covering more ground in hours than he'd previously managed in days. The self-scouring steel plow wasn't just an improvement, it was a revolution. Word of mouth became Deere's most powerful marketing tool. Lewis Crandall couldn't stop talking about his miraculous new plow, and two of his neighbors immediately placed orders with Deere. By 1839, Deere had manufactured 10 improved plows. By 1840, he'd produced 40. By 1841, his annual output had exploded to 75 to 100 plows. The demand was insatiable, driven by desperate farmers who had finally found a tool that could conquer the prairie. But this explosive growth created its own crisis. Deere was still essentially a one-man operation, hand-forging each plow in his small shop. He couldn't scale fast enough to meet demand, and competitors were already beginning to notice his success. The plow that broke the plains was about to face its first existential threat. Could John Deere transition from skilled craftsman to industrial manufacturer before the competition crushed him? The irony is almost poetic. A man who fled Vermont in bankruptcy, who lost his father to the sea, who struggled for 12 years just to keep his blacksmith shops afloat, accidentally stumbled into solving one of the biggest agricultural challenges in American history. John Deere didn't set out to build an empire. He was trying to survive, to feed his 9 children, to pay his debts. He picked up a broken saw blade because steel was expensive and he couldn't afford to waste material. That act of frugal desperation became the foundation of a legacy that would span 188 years and counting. From a discarded piece of metal in 1837 to a global titan dominating agriculture, construction, and forestry by 2025, the journey of John Deere embodies something quintessentially American. The idea that innovation born from necessity, combined with relentless determination, can transform poverty into power and failure into fortune. The year is 1835, and the American dream is collapsing in slow motion across the Midwest. Thousands of pioneer families, lured westward by promises of cheap, fertile land and boundless opportunity, are discovering that the prairie is not their friend. It's their nemesis. Men who successfully cleared forests back east, who built cabins with their bare hands, who survived brutal winters and hostile encounters, are being defeated by something absurdly simple: dirt. Not just any dirt, but the thick, heavy, impossibly sticky black soil of the prairie. A substance so stubbornly adhesive that it transforms farming from productive labor into Sisyphean torture. The cast iron plows that worked perfectly in New England's sandy loam are laughably useless here. Every few feet, farmers must stop, dismount, and manually scrape pounds of accumulated mud from their plow blades. What should take hours stretches into days. What should yield abundance produces only blistered hands, broken spirits, and empty grain stores. Understand this. The prairie soil wasn't just difficult. It was economically catastrophic. A farmer using a traditional cast iron plow in prairie conditions might cover 1 acre in an entire grueling day, stopping dozens, sometimes hundreds of times to clean the blade. Back in Vermont or Pennsylvania, that same farmer could have plowed 3 to 5 acres in the same time with the same effort. The mathematics of survival didn't work. Families needed to plant enough crops to feed themselves through winter, generate surplus to sell for cash, and set aside seed for next year's planting. When your plow clogs every 20 feet, you can't plant enough acreage to survive. The equation was brutally simple. Insufficient plowing meant insufficient planting meant insufficient harvest meant starvation or abandonment. Thousands chose abandonment. They sold their claims for pennies on the dollar or simply walked away, leaving empty cabins and untilled fields as monuments to their failure. The prairie itself seemed designed to mock human ambition. For millions of years, deep-rooted native grasses had grown, died, and decomposed in an endless cycle, creating soil of extraordinary fertility but equally extraordinary density. The root systems of prairie grasses penetrated 6 to 8 feet deep, creating a tangled underground web that resisted breaking. Above ground, the soil's high clay content and organic matter made it incredibly rich for crops but also incredibly sticky. When wet, it became a glutinous mass that adhered to metal with almost adhesive strength. When dry, it hardened into chunks that could bend or break plow blades. Eastern farmers had never encountered anything like it. The light, sandy soils of coastal regions or the forest loams of Appalachia behaved predictably. Prairie soil was a different beast entirely, and it was winning. The plow manufacturers back east either didn't understand or didn't care about the prairie problem. They continued producing cast iron plows using designs that were decades, sometimes centuries old. Iron had always worked for plowing. Why would the prairie be different? This institutional blindness created a massive gap between what pioneers desperately needed and what the industrial establishment was willing to provide. A few experimental plow makers tried modifications. Different blade angles, thicker iron, various coatings. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Cast iron is porous and rough at the microscopic level, providing countless tiny surfaces for sticky soil to grip. No amount of reshaping could change the material's basic properties. What farmers needed was a completely different approach, a material with fundamentally different surface characteristics. But in 1837, no one in the plow manufacturing establishment was thinking that radically. Meanwhile, real families were suffering real consequences. Pioneer diaries and letters from the 1830s and 40s document the grinding despair that prairie farming inflicted. Men wrote of working sunrise to sunset and accomplishing less than a single morning's work back east. Women described watching their husbands age a decade in a single plowing season, their hands bloodied from scraping mud off plow blades, their backs bent from the unnatural stopping and starting. Children went hungry because the family couldn't plant sufficient acres to generate surplus for sale or trade. Some families attempted to avoid plowing altogether, scratching shallow furrows with hoes or trying to plant directly into broken sod. These desperate measures produced minimal yields. Others attempted to farm only the rare patches of sandier soil near riverbanks, leading to overcrowding and depleted land. The prairie, stretching endlessly in every direction with its deep, rich, maddeningly sticky soil, represented both irresistible promise and insurmountable obstacle. The economic implications extended far beyond individual farm failures. State governments and land speculators had invested heavily in prairie territories, expecting massive population influxes and corresponding tax revenues. When farmers began abandoning claims en masse, property values collapsed. Towns that existed primarily to serve agricultural communities found themselves with empty storefronts and dwindling populations. Blacksmiths, general stores, mills, all dependent on a thriving farming economy, struggled as their customer base evaporated. The entire regional economic development model, predicated on successful agricultural settlement, was failing because of an unsolved technical problem. Eastern politicians and businessmen wrung their hands and issued reports, but none of them offered practical solutions. The farmers on the ground, facing their 100th clogged plow blade of the day, didn't need reports. They needed a plow that actually worked. Several thousand companies across America were manufacturing plows by the 1830s, yet not one had successfully addressed the prairie problem. This wasn't for lack of trying. Some manufacturers sent representatives west to observe conditions and gather feedback, but the solution required more than incremental improvements to existing designs. It required a fundamental reimagining of materials and construction. The established manufacturers were trapped by their own success and infrastructure. They had factories tooled for cast iron production, supply chains delivering iron ore, and workers skilled in traditional techniques. Switching to a radically different material and process would require enormous investment with uncertain returns. So they continued producing what they knew, even as reports filtered back that their products were failing spectacularly in the fastest-growing agricultural region in the nation. Enter John Deere, a failed Vermont blacksmith with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Unlike the established manufacturers, Deere had no factory, no infrastructure, no investment in the status quo. He was working alone in a frontier smithy, directly observing desperate farmers scraping mud off useless plows. He heard their frustrations daily, saw the abandoned fields, witnessed the economic devastation. And unlike distant factory owners back east, Deere was a craftsman who worked metal with his own hands. He understood intuitively what laboratory metallurgists were only beginning to document scientifically. Different metals have wildly different surface properties. The rough, porous surface of cast iron created mechanical grip for sticky soil. But polished steel, smooth at the microscopic level, offered virtually no purchase for clinging dirt. The prairie soil would theoretically slide off polished steel the way water slides off glass. But theory and practice are separated by the chasm of execution. Even if Deere was right about polished steel's potential, actually forging a functional plow from steel presented enormous challenges. Steel in 1837 was expensive, difficult to obtain on the frontier, and much harder to work than cast iron. It required higher temperatures to forge, more skill to shape properly, and more time to finish. A cast iron plow could be cast in a mold relatively quickly. A steel plow had to be hand-forged, hammered into shape through dozens or hundreds of heating cycles, and then laboriously polished to achieve the smooth surface that was theoretically essential to its function. For a one-man operation working in a small frontier shop, producing even a single steel plow represented days of intensive labor. If the theory was wrong, if the polished steel didn't actually solve the prairie problem, Deere would have wasted precious time and expensive material he could barely afford. The psychological weight of this gamble cannot be overstated. John Deere was 33 years old, supporting a wife and multiple children, recently relocated from financial ruin in Vermont. He had no safety net, no wealthy backers, no guarantee of success. Every dollar spent on experimental steel was a dollar not spent on food or necessities. Every day devoted to forging an unproven plow design was a day not earning money on conventional blacksmith work. If he failed, he would confirm what everyone already suspected, that he was just another struggling tradesman without the sense to stick to reliable, proven work. But if he succeeded, if his theory about polished steel proved correct, he would solve the single biggest technical obstacle to prairie settlement. He would transform agriculture across millions of acres. He would, though he couldn't possibly know it yet, found a dynasty. So in 1837, while established plow manufacturers continued producing implements that farmers were literally throwing away in frustration, a broke blacksmith in a tiny Illinois settlement was hammering a discarded saw blade into a shape that would change everything. The prairie had broken thousands of men and tens of thousands of plows. It had defeated families, collapsed land values, and stalled westward expansion. The sticky black soil seemed invincible, an agricultural puzzle with no solution. But John Deere, armed with nothing but a theory about polished steel and the desperate determination of a man who had already lost everything once, was about to prove that the prairie could be broken. The question wasn't whether farmers needed a better plow. That was obvious. The question was whether one resourceful blacksmith, working alone in near poverty, could deliver what the entire plow manufacturing industry had failed to create. The answer would come not in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the muddy fields of Illinois, where Lewis Crandall was about to hitch a strange, shiny steel contraption to his team and discover that miracles sometimes emerge from the unlikeliest places. Lewis Crandall was a gambling man, though he didn't know it yet. In early 1838, this Illinois farmer stood in John Deere's modest blacksmith shop, examining a peculiar-looking plow that gleamed like a mirror in the dim light. The blade was polished steel, shaped from a salvaged saw, attached to a carefully curved wrought iron moldboard that Deere had hammered into precise contours over countless heating cycles. It looked nothing like the rough cast-iron plows Crandall had used his entire farming life. Deere quoted a price of approximately $10, a significant sum for a pioneer farmer operating on razor-thin margins. Crandall could have walked away, could have stuck with the devil he knew, could have dismissed this untested contraption as the desperate fantasy of a broke blacksmith. Instead, he handed over his money, hitched the shiny plow to his team, and drove it into his field. What happened next would trigger an agricultural revolution. The plow worked flawlessly. The polished steel share sliced through the sticky prairie soil like a hot knife through butter, and the carefully shaped moldboard lifted and turned the earth in smooth, continuous furrows. Most importantly, miraculously, the soil didn't stick. The dirt that had clung to cast-iron plows like glue simply slid off Deere's polished surfaces, exactly as the blacksmith had theorized. Crandall plowed continuously for hours without stopping once to scrape his blade. He covered more ground in a single morning than he'd previously managed in 2 full days of backbreaking labor. The difference wasn't incremental, it was transformative. Crandall's hands, usually bloodied and blistered from constantly scraping mud, remained intact. His back, usually screaming with pain from the endless stopping and starting, felt strong. His fields, usually a patchwork of incomplete furrows abandoned in exhaustion, stretched before him in neat, productive rows. This wasn't just a better plow. This was word spreads fast in frontier communities, especially when someone discovers something that actually works. Crandall couldn't shut up about his miraculous new plow, showing it off to neighbors, demonstrating its self-scouring capabilities, evangelizing John Deere's genius to anyone who would listen. Within weeks, 2 of Crandall's neighbors appeared at Deere's shop, cash in hand, demanding their own steel plows. Deere, working alone in his small smithy, began forging additional units. In 1839, he produced 10 plows. The progression tells a story more dramatic than any marketing campaign could fabricate. 1840, 40 plows. 1841, 75 plows. 1842, 100 plows. 1843, 400 plows. These aren't just numbers. They're evidence of exponential demand, of farmers desperately grabbing onto the only tool that could actually tame the prairie. But let's pause to appreciate the sheer audacity of what Deere was attempting. He was a one-man operation competing against several thousand established plow manufacturers across America. These companies had factories, distribution networks, established reputations, and economies of scale that Deere couldn't possibly match. They could produce plows faster and cheaper than a lone blacksmith hand-forging each unit in a frontier shop. Under normal market conditions, Deere should have been crushed before he sold his 10th plow. But these weren't normal conditions, and Deere wasn't selling a normal product. He was selling the only plow that actually solved the prairie problem. Performance trumped everything. A farmer could buy a cheap cast-iron plow from an established manufacturer and spend days accomplishing what Deere's plow achieved in hours. The mathematics were irrefutable. Pay $10 for Deere's plow and reclaim your life, or save a few dollars and continue suffering. Thousands chose Deere. The production numbers reveal something else. Deere was operating at the absolute limit of his physical capacity. Forging a single steel plow required days of intensive labor. The steel share had to be cut from scarce steel stock, heated to precise temperatures, hammered into exact shapes, and polished to a mirror finish. The wrought iron moldboard required even more careful work. Its curve had to be mathematically perfect to turn the soil correctly and allow dirt to slide off efficiently. Every angle, every contour, every surface finish mattered. A poorly shaped moldboard would work marginally better than cast iron, which meant it would still fail. Deere couldn't afford marginal improvements. He needed perfection. So he labored obsessively over each plow, heating and reheating metal, hammering and rehammering curves, polishing and repolishing surfaces until they gleamed. 400 plows in 1843 meant 400 individual acts of craftsmanship, each one representing days of brutal physical work. The financial implications were equally staggering. At $10 per plow, Deere's 1843 production generated approximately $4,000 in gross revenue. But that's gross, not net. Steel was expensive, especially on the frontier where it had to be imported from eastern foundries or salvaged from broken mill saws. Wrought iron cost money. Wood for frames and handles cost money. Coal or charcoal for the forge cost money. Tools wore out and needed replacement. Deere likely netted a fraction of his gross revenue, perhaps a third if he was lucky. So after a year of producing 400 plows through backbreaking daily labor, he might have cleared $1,200 to $1,500. That's enough to support a family, enough to pay debts, enough to survive. But it's nowhere near enough to scale up, to hire workers, to build a real factory, to compete with established manufacturers on equal footing. Deere was trapped in a cruel paradox. Demand was exploding beyond his capacity to fulfill it, but he couldn't generate enough profit to expand production. Meanwhile, the established plow manufacturers were beginning to notice this upstart blacksmith stealing their customers. Some dismissed Deere as a frontier novelty whose success would fade once the fad passed. Others took him more seriously, sending representatives to Illinois to observe his plows and gather intelligence. A few unscrupulous competitors simply copied his design, producing their own versions of the polished steel plow and undercutting Deere's prices. Intellectual property protection in 1843 was weak to non-existent, especially on the frontier. Deere wouldn't receive his first moldboard-related patent until 1864, more than 2 decades after introducing his revolutionary design. For years, he operated in a Wild West environment where anyone could steal his innovation, replicate his craftsmanship, and compete for his customers. The only advantages Deere possessed were his reputation for quality and the genuine respect farmers developed for the man who had actually solved their problem. But reputation and respect don't pay bills or feed families when competitors are flooding the market with cheaper knockoffs. Deere faced a strategic crisis that threatened everything he'd built. He could continue operating as a lone craftsman, producing a few hundred plows annually and earning a modest living, watching competitors steal his innovation and dominate the market he'd created. Or he could gamble again, even bigger than before, scaling up operations despite having minimal capital, risking bankruptcy for a second time in pursuit of genuine industrial-scale production. The conservative choice was obvious. Stay small, stay safe, accept limitations. But John Deere hadn't fled Vermont in desperation. hadn't gambled on polished steel when everyone thought he was crazy, and hadn't worked himself to exhaustion producing 400 hand-forged plows just to play it safe now. If the prairie had taught him anything, it was that fortune favors the bold and the desperate in roughly equal measure. The competition Deere faced wasn't just numerous. It was vicious. At its peak, several thousand American companies manufactured plows, each fighting for market share in an increasingly crowded field. These weren't gentlemanly competitors engaging in polite commercial rivalry. They were businesses fighting for survival using every trick available. Price wars, false advertising, industrial espionage, design theft, and aggressive territorial salesmanship. Some manufacturers spread rumors that steel plows were inferior to iron, that the new designs were unproven fads, that Deere's operation was financially unstable. Others hired traveling salesmen who visited farms, badmouthed competitors' products, and offered sweetheart deals to steal customers. The plow wars of the mid-1800s were as ruthless as any modern corporate battle, perhaps more so given the absence of regulations or ethical constraints. What's remarkable is that Deere didn't just survive this bloodbath. He thrived. The secret wasn't superior marketing or aggressive salesmanship, though he would later excel at both. The secret was obsessive, almost pathological commitment to quality. Every plow that left Deere's shop was hand-inspected, personally approved, guaranteed to perform exactly as promised. If a farmer bought a Deere plow and it failed, Deere made it right, either repairing the unit or forging a replacement. This fanatical dedication to customer satisfaction created something more valuable than any advertising campaign: genuine customer loyalty. Farmers who bought Deere plows became evangelists, recommending them to neighbors, defending Deere's reputation against competitors' attacks, and refusing to consider alternatives. In an era before mass media or modern marketing, word-of-mouth recommendation from trusted peers was the most powerful sales tool imaginable. Deere had stumbled onto a truth that modern corporations spend billions trying to replicate. If you solve people's genuine problems and stand behind your work, customers will market for you. By 1843, the trajectory was clear. John Deere had progressed from one experimental plow to 400 units annually in just 6 years. The exponential growth curve showed no signs of slowing. If anything, demand was accelerating faster than production. Farmers across Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and beyond were clamoring for the self-scouring steel plow that could finally tame the prairie. But Deere's one-man operation had reached its absolute limit. He physically couldn't forge more than 400 plows annually without killing himself. The choice loomed before him with crystal clarity: evolve or die, scale or fail, transform from craftsman to industrialist, or watch competitors devour the market he'd created. The broke Vermont blacksmith who had gambled on polished steel was about to make an even bigger bet, one that would either cement his legacy as an industrial titan or destroy him utterly. There's no middle ground when you're forging empires from broken saw blades. By 1843, several thousand American companies were locked in a vicious commercial battle that would make modern corporate warfare look civilized. The plow industry wasn't just competitive, it was a bloodbath. Manufacturers large and small fought desperately for farmers' dollars, employing every tactic imaginable: aggressive price cutting, industrial espionage, design theft, false advertising, and ruthless territorial salesmanship. At the center of this chaos stood John Deere, a former bankrupt blacksmith with a revolutionary product and absolutely zero margin for error. He was facing established giants with deep pockets, vast distribution networks, and decades of market dominance. They could afford to lose battles and still win the war. Deere couldn't afford to lose anything. One major setback would destroy him completely, sending him back to the poverty that had driven him from Vermont. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the enemies couldn't be more numerous. The sheer scale of competition was staggering. Patent records from the 1830s and 40s reveal an explosion of plow designs, with hundreds of new patents filed annually. Every blacksmith with a forge and an idea thought they could build a better plow. Every established manufacturer was constantly tweaking designs, chasing incremental improvements, desperately trying to differentiate their products in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Some focused on weight reduction, creating lighter plows that horses could pull more easily. Others emphasized durability, using thicker iron and reinforced frames. Still others competed on price, cutting corners on materials and craftsmanship to undercut competitors. Into this chaotic free-for-all came John Deere with his self-scouring steel plow, a design so fundamentally superior that it threatened to make every competitor's product obsolete. The established manufacturers noticed, and they were not pleased. The first wave of attacks came through imitation. Within months of Deere's plows gaining popularity, knockoff versions appeared across Illinois and neighboring states. Unscrupulous blacksmiths and small manufacturers examined Deere's design, noted the polished steel share and carefully curved wrought iron moldboard, and attempted to replicate it. Some succeeded partially, creating plows that worked better than traditional cast iron but inferior to Deere's originals. Others failed spectacularly, producing cheap imitations that fooled farmers into wasting money on substandard tools. The problem for Deere was that every failed knockoff damaged the reputation of steel plows generally. When a farmer bought a cheap imitation that didn't work properly, he blamed the concept, not the execution. Deere found himself fighting a two-front war, competing against established cast iron manufacturers while simultaneously defending his innovation against incompetent imitators who were poisoning the market. Intellectual property protection in the 1840s was essentially non-existent, especially on the western frontier. Deere had no patent on his moldboard design until 1864, more than 2 decades after his first plow. Anyone could copy his work with impunity, and many did. The only protection Deere possessed was the difficulty of replicating his craftsmanship. Creating a truly effective self-scouring plow wasn't just about using steel. It required precise shaping, perfect polishing, and exact angles that Deere had perfected through years of trial and error. Most copycat manufacturers couldn't match his quality, which meant their plows underperformed. But some could, and those represented genuine existential threats. A well-funded competitor with skilled craftsmen could theoretically copy Deere's design, produce plows at scale with lower per-unit costs, and destroy him through superior distribution and pricing. Deere's only sustainable advantages were his reputation and his relentless obsession with quality. Then came the business partnership crisis that nearly destroyed everything. In 1843, Deere partnered with Leonard Andrus, the man who had originally convinced him to move to Grand Detour. Andrus provided capital and business acumen. Deere provided craftsmanship and innovation. Together they scaled production dramatically, manufacturing 400 plows in 1843, 700 by 1846, and planning for even greater expansion. But partnerships between craftsmen and businessmen rarely end well when money gets involved. Tensions emerged over quality versus quantity, with Andrus pushing for faster production and Deere insisting on maintaining standards. Disagreements erupted over pricing, distribution, and reinvestment strategies. By 1848, the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Deere made a decision that would define his entire career. He walked away from the partnership, abandoning the Grand Detour operation, and bet everything on relocating to Moline, Illinois. The move to Moline was audacious, bordering on reckless. Grand Detour was Deere's home, where he'd built his reputation, where his customers knew him personally, where his family had established roots. Moline was 75 miles away, a developing town on the Mississippi River with better transportation access but no established Deere presence. Starting over meant rebuilding customer relationships, establishing new supply chains, constructing new facilities, and risking everything on the gamble that better river transportation would offset the costs and disruption of relocation. Deere was 44 years old, supporting 9 children, facing fierce competition from thousands of manufacturers, and choosing to abandon a profitable operation to start fresh in an unproven location. Most men in his position would have stayed put, accepted limitations, and played it safe. Deere chose evolution over stagnation, gambling that access to better steel sources and more efficient distribution via the Mississippi River would provide decisive competitive advantages. Moline transformed Deere's operation from a blacksmith shop into a genuine factory. The Grand Detour years were defined by hand-forging individual plows with obsessive craftsmanship. Moline enabled semi-industrial production, with multiple workers, division of labor, and crucially, reliable access to quality steel shipped up the Mississippi from eastern foundries. The chronic steel shortage that had plagued Deere's early years finally eased. He no longer depended on salvaged saw blades or irregular shipments of unreliable quality. He could order steel in quantity, specify exact characteristics, and build production schedules around guaranteed supply. By 1850, Deere was producing over 1,500 plows annually, a number that would have been physically impossible in Grand Detour. The Moline gamble was paying off spectacularly, but success attracted even fiercer competition. The plow wars intensified throughout the 1850s as more manufacturers recognized the superiority of steel designs and rushed to capture market share. Deere faced competitors on every front. Established Eastern manufacturers with national distribution networks, regional Midwestern companies with local brand loyalty, innovative startups introducing their own variations on the steel plow concept, and countless small-time operators producing cheap knockoffs. Price wars erupted regularly, with manufacturers slashing prices to move inventory, forcing everyone to either match the cuts or lose customers. Quality deteriorated across the industry as companies prioritized volume over craftsmanship. Marketing became increasingly aggressive, with traveling salesmen spreading misinformation about competitors' products and making exaggerated claims about their own. It was commercial warfare at its most brutal, and casualties were everywhere. What separated survivors from failures was adaptability combined with core principles. Deere adapted constantly, improving designs based on farmer feedback, experimenting with new steel alloys and treatments, refining production processes to increase efficiency, and expanding his product line to serve different soil conditions and farming applications. But he never compromised on the core principle that had defined his success from the beginning: obsessive quality control. Every plow leaving his Moline factory was inspected, tested, and guaranteed to perform. Deere would rather produce fewer plows that worked flawlessly than flood the market with inconsistent products. This unwavering commitment to quality created something invaluable: trust. Farmers knew that a plow bearing John Deere's name would work exactly as promised, a guarantee competitors couldn't match because they prioritized quantity over reliability. By the mid-1850s, a pattern had emerged that would define Deere's trajectory for the next century. Thousands of plow manufacturers entered the market, attracted by apparent profitability and low barriers to entry. Most failed within years, unable to compete on quality, price, or distribution. A few hundred survived as regional players serving local markets. Perhaps a dozen achieved genuine national prominence. And one, John Deere, was positioning himself to dominate the entire industry. The journey from one experimental plow in 1837 to industrial leader in 1855 wasn't smooth or inevitable. It was earned through relentless innovation, fanatical quality obsession, strategic risk-taking, and the ability to survive commercial warfare that destroyed thousands of competitors. The plow wars forged Deere into something harder and sharper than any steel blade. An industrial titan who understood that survival required not just making the best product, but continually remaking yourself before competitors could catch up. The blacksmith who fled Vermont in bankruptcy was dead. In his place stood an industrialist who would build an empire that even he couldn't imagine, one revolutionary plow at a time. By 1868, John Deere was 64 years old, exhausted from 3 decades of relentless competition, and facing a decision that would determine whether his legacy survived beyond his lifetime. He had built the most successful plow manufacturing operation in America, producing tens of thousands of units annually and dominating markets across the Midwest. But the operation remained essentially a proprietorship, dependent on his personal leadership, reputation, and decision-making. If Deere died tomorrow, everything he'd built could collapse into chaos as heirs fought over assets, competitors seized market share, and the carefully cultivated brand disintegrated. He needed to transform his personal enterprise into an institutional corporation that could survive and thrive independent of any single individual. On May 14, 1868, John Deere officially incorporated Deere & Company, a decision that would prove both visionary and turbulent beyond anything he could have imagined. The incorporation wasn't just a legal formality. It represented a fundamental shift in organizational philosophy. For 31 years, since that first experimental plow in 1837, Deere had operated with the mindset of a craftsman. Every major decision flowed through him personally. He approved designs, inspected quality, negotiated with suppliers, managed finances, and maintained direct relationships with major customers. This hands-on approach had served him brilliantly during the growth years, ensuring consistent quality and preserving the reputation that differentiated Deere plows from inferior competitors. But it created a dangerous bottleneck as the operation scaled. By the late 1860s, Deere and Company employed dozens of workers, operated multiple facilities, served customers across numerous states, and managed complex supply chains. One man, even a genius craftsman entrepreneur, couldn't personally oversee every detail of an operation that large. Deere needed partners, executives, managers who could share responsibilities and drive continued growth. Enter Charles Deere, John's son, the man who would prove both the company's salvation and his father's greatest source of frustration. Charles was born in 1837, the same year his father forged that revolutionary first plow, creating a symbolic connection between the man and the company that would define both their lives. Unlike his father, Charles didn't grow up in poverty. He enjoyed relative prosperity, received better education, and developed business sophistication that John, the self-taught blacksmith, never fully acquired. Charles understood marketing, finance, distribution networks, and corporate strategy in ways that John, for all his genius with metal and mechanics, simply didn't. But father and son approached business with fundamentally different philosophies that would generate decades of creative tension. John valued quality above all else, willing to sacrifice speed and profit margins to ensure every plow met his exacting standards. Charles prioritized growth, market share, and competitive positioning, sometimes pushing for expansion that John considered reckless. The generational clash was inevitable and, ironically, exactly what the company needed. John Deere's obsessive quality control had built the brand's reputation, but his conservative risk aversion limited growth opportunities. Charles Deere's aggressive expansion instincts opened new markets and increased scale, but without his father's quality obsession, the brand could have deteriorated into mediocrity. Together, they formed a complementary partnership that balanced innovation with reliability, growth with sustainability, ambition with craftsmanship. But complementary doesn't mean harmonious. Father and son argued constantly over strategy, with John resisting initiatives he considered too risky and Charles chafing under what he viewed as outdated caution. Board meetings at the newly incorporated Deere and Company often devolved into family disputes, with other executives caught awkwardly between the founder's legendary authority and his son's modern vision. The 1870s marked Deere and Company's transformation from regional manufacturer to national powerhouse. A decade of explosive growth that validated Charles's aggressive strategies while confirming John's worst fears about losing control. In 1874, the company faced a critical decision about a revolutionary new product, the Gilpin sulky plow, developed by inventor Gilpin Moore. Traditional plows required farmers to walk behind the implement, guiding it through soil while their team pulled. The sulky plow featured a seat, allowing farmers to ride while plowing, dramatically reducing fatigue and increasing productivity. It was a genuine innovation, but it was also expensive to produce, unproven in the market, and a significant departure from Deere's core walking plow business. John Deere, now 70 years old, was skeptical. Charles saw opportunity. The company gambled on the Gilpin sulky, and it became their most successful product of the 19th century, generating revenues that funded further expansion and cemented Deere's reputation as an innovation leader, not just a quality manufacturer. By 1876, Deere and Company was producing over 60,000 plows annually, a number that would have seemed fantastical in the Grand Detour blacksmith shop days. The Moline facilities had expanded repeatedly, incorporating new buildings, advanced machinery, and sophisticated production processes that would have been unrecognizable to the craftsmen who once hand-forged individual plows. The company employed hundreds of workers, operated dedicated sales offices across multiple states, and shipped products via railroads and riverboats to customers from Minnesota to Texas. But this spectacular growth created its own crisis: brand confusion. As Deere plows flooded markets, competitors produced increasingly sophisticated knockoffs, some so convincing that farmers couldn't distinguish authentic Deere products from cheap imitations. The company desperately needed a distinctive, legally protectable trademark that could differentiate genuine Deere equipment from the flood of counterfeits. In 1876, Charles Deere convinced his father to register the company's first official trademark, the now iconic leaping Deere logo. The image depicted a graceful deer mid-leap over a fallen log, a symbol that brilliantly captured multiple brand attributes simultaneously. The deer represented agility, strength, and the natural world that agriculture depended upon. The leap suggested progress, innovation, and overcoming obstacles, themes that resonated with pioneer farmers who had used Deere plows to conquer the impossible prairie. The log symbolized the obstacles that both Deere and farmers must clear to succeed. It was marketing genius wrapped in elegant simplicity, a visual identity so memorable and distinctive that it would endure for nearly 150 years and counting. John Deere, the craftsman who had once salvaged broken saw blades, now presided over a corporation with a registered trademark, corporate bylaws, multiple executives, and national market presence. The transformation was complete, though John himself never fully adjusted to it. The acquisition strategy that would eventually make Deere & Company the world's largest agricultural equipment manufacturer began modestly in the 1870s and 80s. Rather than trying to internally develop every new product line, Charles Deere advocated purchasing successful smaller manufacturers and integrating their operations, products, and expertise into the growing Deere empire. It was a strategy common among industrial corporations of the Gilded Age, but it required capital, sophisticated financial management, and willingness to absorb companies with different cultures and practices. John Deere, whose entire career had been defined by organic growth from his own innovations, found this approach deeply uncomfortable. He worried about quality control, brand dilution, and loss of the personal touch that had always characterized Deere products. Charles argued that standing still meant death, that competitors were consolidating aggressively, and that Deere & Company would either grow through strategic acquisitions or eventually be acquired itself. The father-son debates over expansion strategy revealed a deeper tension about what Deere & Company actually was. John still thought of it as his shop, an extension of his personal craftsmanship and values, temporarily grown large. Charles understood it as an industrial corporation that happened to bear his father's name, an entity that must evolve independent of any individual's preferences to survive in an increasingly competitive, consolidated marketplace. Both perspectives contain truth. The company's strength derived directly from John Deere's founding values: obsessive quality, continuous innovation, and genuine respect for farmers' needs. But those values could only reach their full potential through the institutional structures, professional management, and strategic growth that Charles championed. The tension between craftsman's soul and corporate body would define Deere & Company for generations, ensuring it never lost its connection to quality even as it grew into a multi-billion-dollar giant. By 1886, when John Deere died at age 82, Deere & Company was unrecognizable from the single-man blacksmith shop that had produced one experimental plow 49 years earlier. The company operated multiple factories, employed thousands of workers, served customers across the nation, offered dozens of different plow models and agricultural implements, and generated annual revenues measured in millions of dollars. Charles Deere assumed full leadership, free to implement the aggressive expansion strategies his father had resisted. But Charles never abandoned the core principle that John had drilled into every employee, every product, every decision: quality is not negotiable. A famous quote attributed to John Deere captured this philosophy perfectly: "I will never put my name on a product that does not have in it the best that is in me." That commitment, forged in a desperate Vermont blacksmith's determination to never fail again, would carry Deere & Company through the next century of competition, innovation, and transformation. The blacksmith was gone, but his obsession lived on, embedded in the corporate DNA of an empire that bore his name and honored his legacy by never compromising on the values that had transformed a broken saw blade into a $43 billion dynasty. By 1918, Deere and Company faced an existential crisis disguised as opportunity. For 81 years, since John Deere forged his first self-scouring plow in 1837, the company had dominated the animal-powered farming equipment market. Plows, harrows, cultivators, planters, every implement designed to be pulled by horses or oxen. Deere manufactured them better than anyone. But the world was changing with terrifying speed, and the agent of disruption was the gasoline-powered tractor, a mechanical beast that threatened to make horse-drawn equipment as obsolete as the cast-iron plows that John Deere had destroyed decades earlier. Competitors like International Harvester and Ford Motor Company were already mass-producing tractors, capturing market share and redefining agriculture. Deere, the undisputed champion of the 19th century, was in serious danger of becoming irrelevant in the 20th. The company needed tractors, needed them desperately, and needed them immediately. But Deere had zero experience manufacturing engines or motorized equipment, and developing tractor technology from scratch would take years the company didn't have. The solution arrived in the form of the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, a small Iowa manufacturer that had been producing gasoline engines and tractors since 1893. Their flagship product, the Waterloo Boy tractor, was crude by modern standards but reliable, proven, and crucially, already in production with established distribution networks. In March 1918, Deere and Company made one of the most important acquisitions in its history, purchasing Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company for approximately $2,300,000. It wasn't just a company purchase. It was survival insurance, a desperate gamble that Deere could integrate tractor manufacturing into its operations before competitors monopolized the motorized farming equipment market. The Waterloo Boy tractor, with its distinctive horizontal two-cylinder engine producing 12 drawbar horsepower, became Deere's entry ticket into the 20th century. It was loud, heavy, unsophisticated, and absolutely revolutionary compared to the alternative of plowing with horses. The transition from animal power to mechanical power represented more than a technological shift. It was a complete reimagining of agriculture's fundamental economics. A good team of horses could plow perhaps 2 to 3 acres per day, required constant feeding, needed rest, and represented significant ongoing costs even when not working. A Waterloo Boy tractor could plow 10 to 12 acres per day, operated on kerosene or gasoline, required no feeding when idle, and worked as long as fuel remained in the tank. The productivity multiplication was staggering, but so was the upfront investment. A farmer could buy a decent team of horses for a few $100s. A Waterloo Boy tractor cost over $1,000, equivalent to multiple years of profit for many small farmers. Deere was asking customers to bet their financial futures on improving technology, to abandon farming methods their grandfathers had used, to trust that these noisy, complicated machines wouldn't break down during critical planting or harvesting seasons. It was a tough sell, and early adoption was slow and skeptical. But the farmers who took the leap never looked back. The productivity gains were simply too dramatic to ignore. A single farmer with a tractor could work land that previously required multiple hired hands and multiple horse teams. This meant fewer labor costs, faster planting cycles, more efficient harvesting, and ultimately, higher profits despite the significant equipment investment. Word spread through farming communities with the same unstoppable momentum that had powered the steel plow revolution 80 years earlier. By the early 1920s, tractor sales were accelerating exponentially, and Deere's decision to acquire Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company was proving brilliantly prescient. The company that had revolutionized plowing was now revolutionizing the power source itself, ensuring its dominance extended seamlessly into the mechanized age. But Deere wasn't content to simply rebrand someone else's technology. The company's DNA demanded continuous innovation, relentless improvement, and products that set industry standards rather than following them. In 1923, Deere introduced the Model D tractor, the first tractor designed and built entirely under the John Deere banner rather than inherited from the Waterloo acquisition. The Model D featured Deere's signature horizontal two-cylinder engine, producing more horsepower than the Waterloo Boy while incorporating numerous design improvements based on farmer feedback and field testing. More importantly, it established Deere's reputation for building tractors with the same obsessive quality control that had defined its plows. The Model D would remain in production for 30 years, selling over 160,000 units and becoming one of the longest-running tractor models in agricultural history. Its success validated Deere's strategy: acquire technology to enter new markets quickly, then innovate relentlessly to dominate those markets completely. Competitors might have started the tractor revolution, but Deere intended to finish it on top. The 1930s and 40s saw explosive tractor innovation as Deere expanded its product line to serve farms of every size and type. Small farms needed compact, affordable tractors that could navigate tight spaces and perform diverse tasks. Large operations demanded powerful machines capable of pulling multiple implements simultaneously across vast acreages. Specialty crops required tractors with specific capabilities: high clearance for row crops, narrow profiles for orchard work, heavy pulling power for breaking virgin soil. Deere developed distinct models for each market segment, creating a comprehensive product portfolio that ensured a John Deere tractor existed for virtually every farming application. The Model A, B, and G tractors became legendary in their respective categories, each one refined through countless iterations based on real-world farming experience. Deere's engineers didn't design tractors in isolation. They worked directly with farmers, testing prototypes in actual field conditions and incorporating feedback into production models. Then came 1947 and the Model M, a compact tractor that redefined versatility for small and medium-sized farms. The Model M featured Deere's first vertical two-cylinder engine, mounted at the front of the tractor rather than longitudinally, creating better weight distribution and improved maneuverability. Could handle plowing, cultivation, mowing, and dozens of other tasks by quickly swapping attached implements. The Model M became wildly successful, selling over 80,000 units and establishing Deere's dominance in the compact tractor segment. But the real revolution was still coming, gestating in Deere's engineering departments through the 1950s, preparing to explode onto the market in 1960 with a product launch so ambitious and comprehensive that it would redefine what a tractor company could achieve. August 30th, 1960. Deere & Company unveiled the new generation of power, the most significant product launch in the company's 123-year history. In a single coordinated event held in Dallas, Texas, Deere introduced 4 entirely new tractor models simultaneously: the 3010 series, 4010 series, 3020 series, and 4020 series. These weren't incremental improvements to existing designs. They were ground-up reimaginings of what modern tractors should be. Deere abandoned its traditional horizontal two-cylinder engines in favor of new multi-cylinder engines, producing dramatically more horsepower and torque. The tractors featured revolutionary hydraulic systems, improved operator comfort, advanced transmission designs, and styling that looked genuinely futuristic compared to competitors' offerings. The Dallas launch event drew over 6,000 dealers from across North America, and the response was overwhelming. Deere took orders for enough tractors to fill production schedules for months, confirming that the massive investment in new engine technology and manufacturing facilities had been absolutely justified. The new generation tractors did more than sell well. They cemented Deere's position as the innovation leader in agricultural equipment, the company competitors measured themselves against rather than competed with as equals. International Harvester, Ford, Massey Ferguson, and other manufacturers scrambled to respond, but they were years behind Deere's development curve. The new generation's multi-cylinder engines produced more power more efficiently, the hydraulics enabled more sophisticated implement control, and the operator stations were comfortable enough for all-day use without physical exhaustion. Farmers who bought new generation tractors became evangelists, recommending them to neighbors and refusing to consider alternatives. The brand loyalty that John Deere had built with self-scouring plows in 1837 now extended to tractors that represented the absolute pinnacle of 1960s agricultural technology. The leaping Deere logo didn't just mean quality anymore. It meant leading-edge innovation, a guarantee that buying Deere equipment meant buying the future of farming. But the story doesn't end with domestic success. By the 1950s and 60s, Deere's leadership recognized that international markets represented the next frontier for growth. The company had operated in Canada since 1912, but serious global expansion required manufacturing facilities on multiple continents, not just exports from American factories. In 1956, Deere built an assembly factory in Mexico and acquired Heinrich Lanz, a German tractor manufacturer, marking the company's first major moves into international manufacturing. Acquisitions and factory construction followed in France, Spain, Argentina, and South Africa throughout the 1960s and 70s. These international operations initially lost money, hemorrhaging cash due to unfamiliar markets, foreign exchange complications, and the enormous costs of establishing manufacturing infrastructure in developing regions. But Deere's leadership believed, correctly, that long-term survival required global presence, that companies serving only domestic markets would eventually be marginalized by competitors who dominated worldwide. The short-term losses were investments in future dominance. From 1918 to the 1970s, Deere and Company transformed from a plow manufacturer watching the world change into a global tractor powerhouse driving that change. The Waterloo Boy acquisition had saved the company from irrelevance. The Model D, Model M, and new generation tractors had established unassailable market leadership. International expansion had positioned Deere to serve farmers on every continent. The blacksmith's son who forged a revolutionary plow in 1837 couldn't have imagined that his company would one day manufacture machines producing over 100 horsepower, guided by hydraulics and electronics, serving customers from Iowa to Indonesia. But the core values remained unchanged. Solve farmers' real problems with superior engineering, never compromise quality for short-term profits, and continuously innovate because standing still means death. The iron horses that replaced real horses bore the leaping Deere logo proudly, carrying John Deere's legacy into an era of mechanization he never lived to see but absolutely would have embraced with the same desperate determination that once salvaged a broken saw blade and changed agriculture forever. By the 1960s, Deere and Company leadership faced an uncomfortable truth that threatened everything the company had built over 130 years. Agriculture was cyclical, brutally so, swinging from boom years when farmers bought equipment eagerly to devastating busts when drought, falling commodity prices, or oversupply caused sales to collapse. During good years, Deere's factories ran at capacity, profits soared, and shareholders celebrated. During bad years, layoffs devastated communities, assembly lines sat idle, and the company hemorrhaged cash while waiting for agricultural markets to recover. This boom-bust cycle was existential risk disguised as normal business operations. A company dependent on a single industry, no matter how dominant within that industry, was vulnerable to forces completely beyond its control. Weather patterns, global commodity markets, government farm policies, international trade disputes. Deere needed diversification, needed it desperately, needed revenue streams that didn't rise and fall with corn prices and rainfall. The question wasn't whether to expand beyond agriculture, but where and how. The construction equipment market represented the most obvious diversification opportunity, a multi-billion-dollar industry serving contractors, developers, municipalities, and infrastructure projects worldwide. Construction demand followed different cycles than agriculture, driven by economic growth, urbanization, government spending, and real estate development rather than crop prices and growing seasons. When agricultural equipment sales collapsed, construction markets might be booming, and vice versa. The strategic logic was irresistible. Diversification would smooth revenue volatility, reduce dependence on agriculture's brutal cycles, and position Deere to serve multiple industries rather than gambling everything on farming. But entering construction equipment wasn't simple. Deere had zero brand recognition among contractors, no distribution networks serving construction sites, and limited expertise manufacturing the specialized equipment that construction demanded. The company that dominated farming was a complete unknown in construction, facing entrenched competitors like Caterpillar who had spent decades building relationships and reputation in that market. Deere's solution followed the same pattern that had worked brilliantly with tractors. Acquire established companies to gain immediate market presence, then leverage Deere's engineering excellence and manufacturing scale to dominate over time. In 1963, Deere acquired Dubuque Wagon Works and began producing construction equipment under the John Deere name. The early products were modest, small industrial tractors, loaders, and basic earth-moving equipment designed for light construction and landscaping applications. But they established Deere's presence and allowed the company to learn construction customers' needs, which differed dramatically from farmers' requirements. Construction equipment operated in harsher environments, faced more abuse, and required different performance characteristics than agricultural machinery. Deere's engineers immersed themselves in construction sites, observing how contractors used equipment, identifying pain points and opportunities, and designing solutions specifically for construction applications rather than simply repurposing agricultural technology. The breakthrough came with compact construction equipment, a market segment that barely existed when Deere entered it but would eventually generate billions in annual revenue. Small skid steer loaders, compact track loaders, and mini excavators could navigate tight urban construction sites, work in confined spaces where larger equipment couldn't operate, and perform diverse tasks by quickly swapping attachments. These versatile machines appealed to small contractors, landscapers, municipalities, and rental companies who needed flexibility more than raw power. Deere's compact construction equipment featured the same obsessive quality control that defined its agricultural products, built to survive years of brutal daily use in conditions that destroyed inferior competitors' machines. The iconic green and yellow color scheme, initially associated exclusively with farming, began appearing on construction sites worldwide. Contractors who had never considered John Deere for construction equipment discovered that the company's reputation for reliability translated perfectly to excavators and loaders. The leaping Deere logo became a symbol of quality in construction just as it had been in agriculture. But construction was only part of the diversification story. Forestry equipment represented another enormous market opportunity, serving timber companies, logging operations, and forest management organizations across North America and Europe. Trees are harvested year-round regardless of agricultural cycles, creating steady demand for specialized forestry machinery. In 1991, Deere acquired Timberjack, a Finnish forestry equipment manufacturer, instantly gaining access to advanced forestry technology and established relationships with timber companies. Deere's forestry division produces harvesters that can fell, delimb, and cut trees to specified lengths in minutes, forwarders that transport logs from cutting sites to loading areas, and skidders that drag timber through difficult terrain. These specialized machines operate in some of the harshest conditions imaginable: steep mountain slopes, dense forests, extreme weather, and terrain that would destroy conventional equipment. Deere's engineering excellence and commitment to durability proved perfectly suited to forestry's demanding requirements, and the forestry division grew into a significant revenue contributor. Then came turf care, a market that seemed almost trivial compared to agriculture and construction but would eventually represent substantial business. Golf courses, sports facilities, professional landscapers, municipalities managing parks, and even homeowners with large properties all needed specialized equipment for maintaining turf. Deere entered this market through acquisitions and internal development, producing commercial mowing equipment, golf course maintenance machinery, and consumer lawn tractors. The consumer lawn and garden equipment division might have seemed beneath a company that manufactured 100-ton mining excavators, but it served crucial strategic purposes. Consumer products introduced the John Deere brand to millions of people who would never operate a farm tractor or construction loader. A homeowner mowing his lawn with a John Deere riding mower developed brand loyalty that might influence future equipment purchases when he started a landscaping business or construction company. The consumer division also provided relatively stable revenue during agricultural and construction downturns, as people continued maintaining their lawns regardless of broader economic conditions. The strategic wisdom of diversification became painfully obvious during the 1980s farm crisis, the worst agricultural economic collapse since the Great Depression. Falling commodity prices, crushing debt loads, and a strong dollar that devastated agricultural exports combined to destroy American farming's financial foundation. Thousands of farmers went bankrupt, losing land their families had worked for generations. Agricultural equipment sales collapsed completely. Farmers couldn't afford to buy new tractors when they were struggling to avoid foreclosure. Deere's agricultural division faced catastrophic losses that would have destroyed the company had agriculture remained its only business. But construction and forestry divisions continued generating revenue, providing financial lifelines that kept Deere solvent while agricultural markets slowly recovered. The diversification that leadership had pursued aggressively during the 1960s and 70s quite literally saved the company from bankruptcy during the 1980s crisis. Companies that had remained purely agricultural equipment manufacturers either failed completely or were acquired by diversified competitors who survived the downturn. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Deere's product portfolio was almost unrecognizable compared to its agricultural roots. Yes, the company still manufactured combines, tractors, and planters, still dominated agricultural equipment markets globally. But it also produced articulated dump trucks for mining operations, wheeled excavators for urban construction, forestry harvesters processing millions of board feet of timber annually, and commercial mowers maintaining golf courses from California to Scotland. The green and yellow machines invaded every continent, serving industries John Deere himself could never have imagined. When oil and gas exploration boomed, Deere construction equipment built drilling sites and pipeline infrastructure. When renewable energy emerged, Deere equipment constructed wind farms and solar installations. When disaster struck, Deere machines cleared debris and rebuilt communities. The company had transformed from a farm equipment manufacturer into a diversified industrial titan serving agriculture, construction, forestry, and numerous specialized applications. The financial impact of diversification was staggering. By 2025, construction and forestry equipment represented approximately 40% of Deere and Company's total revenue, with agriculture making up the remaining 60%. This balance meant agricultural downturns, which still occurred regularly, no longer threatened the company's survival. When farm equipment sales declined, construction and forestry divisions often compensated. When construction markets collapsed during recessions, agricultural equipment sometimes remained strong. The diversification strategy provided financial stability that pure agricultural companies could never achieve, enabling Deere to weather economic storms, invest continuously in research and development, and maintain the long-term perspective necessary for sustained innovation. The company that almost died during the 1980s farm crisis because it depended too heavily on agriculture had become virtually bulletproof through strategic diversification. But here's the profound irony. Even as Deere expanded far beyond its agricultural origins, the core values that John Deere established in 1837 remained absolutely central to everything the company did. Whether manufacturing a combine harvester for a Kansas wheat farmer, a compact excavator for a Boston contractor, a forestry harvester for a Finnish timber company, or a commercial mower for a Florida golf course, Deere insisted on the same obsessive quality control, continuous innovation, and genuine respect for customers' needs that had defined the original self-scouring plow. The machinery changed, the industries changed, the scale changed beyond recognition. But the commitment to solving real problems with superior engineering never wavered. The blacksmith who salvaged a broken saw blade would absolutely recognize the values driving the $43 billion diversified corporation bearing his name, even if the products themselves would seem like alien technology. From steel plows that broke the prairie to excavators that build cities to harvesters that process forests, 188 years of relentless adaptation in service of unchanging principles. Picture a Kansas wheat farmer in 1995, sitting on a $100,000 John Deere combine harvester, manually steering through his fields using visual landmarks and decades of experience to maintain straight rows and avoid overlapping passes. Now picture that same farmer's son in 2015, piloting a $400,000 combine guided by satellites orbiting 20,000 kilometers above Earth, with onboard computers analyzing yield data in real time, automatically adjusting machine settings for optimal performance, and transmitting harvest information wirelessly to cloud servers for analysis. The transformation from mechanical farming to digital agriculture happened faster than most people realize, and John Deere didn't just participate in this revolution. The company that built its reputation on polished steel plows became one of the world's most aggressive technology companies, investing billions in software, sensors, artificial intelligence, and data analytics. But this digital transformation sparked fierce controversies about ownership, privacy, and whether farmers truly controlled the increasingly computerized machines they purchased. When steel met silicon, agriculture changed forever, and not everyone was celebrating. The digital revolution began modestly in the 1990s with GPS guidance systems adapted from military technology. The United States Department of Defense had developed the Global Positioning System for military navigation, using satellites to provide precise location data anywhere on Earth. When GPS became available for civilian use, agricultural engineers recognized revolutionary potential. Tractors and combines equipped with GPS receivers could track their exact positions within fields, maintaining perfectly straight rows, eliminating overlaps that wasted fuel and inputs, and creating digital maps of every acre. The productivity improvements were substantial. Farmers reduced fuel consumption by 10 to 15%, decreased fertilizer and chemical waste through precision application, and increased effective planting area by eliminating overlap. Early GPS systems required farmers to manually steer while watching display screens showing guidance lines. It was better than eyeballing landmarks, but still demanded constant attention and created fatigue during long operating days. In 2001, Deere introduced AutoTrack and farming entered the fiction era. AutoTrack was hands-free automatic steering controlled by GPS, allowing tractors and combines to follow predetermined paths with centimeter-level accuracy while operators monitored performance rather than physically steering. Imagine driving a vehicle at highway speeds through a field, reading a book or making phone calls while the machine steers itself with greater precision than any human could achieve manually. That's AutoTrack. Farmers who spent entire careers fighting fatigue from manually steering heavy equipment for 12 to 16 hours daily during planting and harvest suddenly found themselves supervising autonomous machines. The psychological shift was profound. Operators transitioned from drivers to supervisors, from manual laborers to equipment managers. AutoTrack wasn't just a convenience feature. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to operate agricultural machinery. The technology improved productivity so dramatically that within a decade, GPS guidance systems transitioned from expensive luxury options to essential standard equipment that farmers considered non-negotiable. But GPS guidance was only the beginning. Deere's engineers recognized that true precision agriculture required comprehensive data collection, real-time analysis, and automated responses to constantly changing field conditions. Modern tractors and combines became rolling sensor platforms, collecting thousands of data points per second about soil conditions, moisture levels, plant health, yield variations, machine performance, and operational efficiency. Soil sensors measured organic matter content, compaction, pH levels, and nutrient availability, creating detailed maps showing exactly which areas needed specific treatments. Yield monitors in combines measured grain flow continuously, generating precise maps showing productivity variations across every acre. Moisture sensors determined optimal harvest timing and adjusted machine settings automatically for different crop conditions. These weren't simple measurements. They were comprehensive data ecosystems generating terabytes of information annually, all requiring sophisticated software to collect, transmit, store, analyze, and convert into actionable recommendations. The Internet of Things arrived on farms with force that surprised even technology industry observers. IoT refers to networks of connected devices communicating wirelessly to share data and coordinate operations. Deere-equipped tractors, combines, planters, sprayers, and other implements with cellular or satellite connectivity, allowing continuous real-time communication between machines, operators, agronomists, and farm managers. A planter moving through a field automatically adjusted seeding rates based on soil quality maps, weather forecasts, and historical yield data, optimizing population for maximum productivity. Sprayers varied application rates precisely, reducing chemical use in low-need areas while increasing coverage where pests or diseases threaten crops. Multiple machines working simultaneously coordinated operations automatically, eliminating conflicts and maximizing efficiency. Farm managers sitting in offices hundreds of miles away monitored equipment performance in real time, receiving instant alerts about mechanical issues, maintenance needs, or operational problems. The machines had become intelligent, networked, and increasingly autonomous, operating more like industrial robots than traditional farm equipment. Deere's digital transformation required massive investments in capabilities far beyond traditional mechanical engineering. The company acquired technology startups, hired thousands of software engineers, established data divisions, and invested billions in cloud computing infrastructure. In 2017, Deere acquired Blue River Technology, a startup developing machine vision systems and artificial intelligence for agriculture. Blue River's see and spray technology used cameras and AI algorithms to identify individual plants in real time, distinguishing crops from weeds with extraordinary accuracy and applying herbicides only to weeds rather than broadcasting chemicals across entire fields. This precision reduced herbicide use by up to 90% while maintaining or improving weed control. The acquisition signaled Deere's commitment to becoming a technology company that happened to manufacture agricultural equipment rather than an equipment company that incorporated some technology. The strategic implications were profound. Deere was competing directly with Silicon Valley tech giants for engineering talent, cloud computing capabilities, and artificial intelligence expertise. But the digital revolution created backlash that Deere neither anticipated nor handled particularly well initially. As equipment became increasingly computerized, Deere implemented software controls that limited farmers' ability to repair or modify their own machines. Deere argued that proprietary software protecting emission systems, safety features, and performance algorithms required restricted access to prevent tampering that could cause environmental violations or safety hazards. Farmers argued they owned their equipment outright and should possess absolute rights to repair, modify, or even hack machines they'd purchased with their own money. The conflict intensified when farmers discovered they couldn't perform basic repairs without Deere-authorized technicians accessing diagnostic software, creating situations where broken equipment sat idle during critical planting or harvest windows while waiting for authorized service. Independent repair shops that had served farmers for generations found themselves locked out of equipment diagnostics, unable to compete with Deere's service network. The right-to-repair movement gained momentum throughout the 2010s, with farmers, consumer advocates, and independent repair businesses demanding legislation guaranteeing equipment owners rights to repair products they purchased. The conflict exposed fundamental tensions between traditional notions of property ownership and modern realities of software-controlled products. When you buy a $400,000 combine, do you own it completely, including all software and the right to modify anything? Or do you own the hardware while licensing software that remains Deere's intellectual property subject to restrictions? These questions, which seemed academic in legal classrooms, had real consequences for farmers facing equipment failures during narrow planting and harvest windows, when delays measured in days could cost tens of thousands in lost productivity or crop damage. The controversy damaged Deere's reputation among customers who had trusted the brand for generations, creating resentment that competitors exploited aggressively in marketing campaigns emphasizing simpler, more farmer-friendly equipment. Deere eventually adjusted its policies, expanding farmers' access to diagnostic tools and repair information while maintaining restrictions on modifications that could violate emissions regulations or safety standards. The compromise satisfied neither hardcore right-to-repair advocates nor Deere's legal department completely, but it reduced tensions and acknowledged legitimate concerns from both sides. The controversy revealed important lessons about digital transformation's social and legal complexities. Technology that dramatically improved productivity and efficiency also concentrated power and information in ways that challenged traditional relationships between manufacturers and customers. Farmers who had operated independently for generations suddenly found themselves dependent on manufacturers' software and data platforms, creating vulnerabilities and resentments that wouldn't exist with purely mechanical equipment. The digital revolution delivered extraordinary benefits, but it also imposed costs that weren't purely financial. By 2025, precision agriculture had become standard practice rather than cutting-edge innovation. Modern farms operated more like technology companies than traditional agricultural operations, with operators analyzing data dashboards, consulting AI-generated recommendations, and managing autonomous equipment through software interfaces. The productivity gains were undeniable. Farmers produced more food on less land with fewer inputs, reducing environmental impacts while feeding growing global populations. Deere's transformation from mechanical manufacturer to technology powerhouse positioned the company to dominate agriculture's increasingly digital future. But the journey from steel to silicon proved that innovation always involves trade-offs, that progress creates winners and losers, and that even revolutionary improvements generate legitimate concerns requiring thoughtful responses. John Deere would probably be simultaneously amazed and troubled by machines bearing his name that could farm autonomously guided by satellites while farmers argued about software ownership rights. The blacksmith who polished steel to solve farmers' problems would recognize the motivation even if the technology seemed like magic. Stand at the corner of Wall Street and look at the numbers flashing across Bloomberg terminals in 2025. Deere & Company, trading under the symbol DE on the New York Stock Exchange, commands a market capitalization hovering around $43 billion, fluctuating daily based on agricultural commodity prices, construction demand forecasts, global economic conditions, and investor sentiment. The company that began with one experimental steel plow sold for $10 in 1838 now generates annual revenues exceeding $50 billion, employs approximately 83,000 people worldwide, operates manufacturing facilities across 5 continents, and serves customers in nearly every country on Earth. The leaping deer logo appears on equipment working rice paddies in Vietnam, wheat fields in Ukraine, construction sites in Dubai, logging operations in Brazil, and suburban lawns in suburban America. From a desperate Vermont blacksmith fleeing bankruptcy to a diversified industrial colossus dominating multiple global markets, the journey spans 188 years of relentless innovation, strategic evolution, and unwavering commitment to solving customers' real problems with superior engineering. But let's be brutally honest about the current reality. Being a $43 billion giant doesn't mean invulnerability or guaranteed success. Deere faces challenges in 2025 that would terrify the company's 19th century founders. Threats emerging from directions John Deere couldn't have imagined when he polished that first steel blade. Global supply chain disruptions, triggered by pandemic aftershocks and geopolitical tensions, still plague manufacturing operations, creating unpredictable delays in parts availability and forcing difficult decisions about production schedules. Trade wars and tariffs threaten international operations that generate nearly half of total revenue, with agricultural equipment sales particularly vulnerable to protectionist policies that can evaporate export markets overnight. Climate change creates both opportunities and existential risks, with extreme weather events damaging crops and reducing farmers' equipment purchasing power while simultaneously increasing demand for precision agriculture technology that helps farmers adapt to unpredictable conditions. The modern Deere navigates complexity that makes 19th century plow wars look simple by comparison. The competitive landscape has transformed dramatically from the thousands of small plow manufacturers John Deere once battled. Today's competition comes from established industrial giants with comparable scale and resources. CNH Industrial, AGCO Corporation, Kubota, and Caterpillar in construction equipment. These aren't small regional manufacturers that can be defeated through superior craftsmanship alone. They're multi-billion-dollar corporations with global operations, sophisticated technology platforms, and aggressive strategies for capturing market share. CNH Industrial, formed through the merger of Case and New Holland, directly challenges Deere across agricultural and construction equipment categories. AGCO, which owns brands including Massey Ferguson and Fendt, has gained ground in international markets where Deere historically dominated. Kubota, the Japanese manufacturer, has built formidable presence in compact equipment segments serving landscapers, small farms, and construction contractors. The competition isn't just fierce, it's existential, with each major player investing billions in autonomous equipment, precision agriculture platforms, and electric powertrains racing to define the industry's future. Then there's the disruptive threat from unexpected directions. Technology companies with zero agricultural or construction heritage, but enormous resources and ambitions. Companies like Alphabet, Amazon, and Chinese tech giants view agriculture as a data opportunity, a market where sensors, AI algorithms, and cloud computing platforms can create value independent of physical machinery. These companies could theoretically develop precision agriculture software platforms that work with any manufacturer's equipment, commoditizing the hardware and capturing value through recurring software subscriptions. If farmers can achieve comparable results using generic tractors equipped with third-party precision agriculture platforms, Deere's integrated hardware-software strategy loses its competitive advantage. The nightmare scenario keeping Deere executives awake involves agriculture following the personal computer industry's trajectory, where hardware became commoditized and value concentrated in operating systems and software controlled by companies like Microsoft. Deere's massive investments in technology represent bets that integrated solutions combining proprietary hardware and software will deliver superior performance that justifies premium pricing and maintains customer loyalty. The financial performance numbers tell a story of volatility characteristic of capital equipment manufacturers serving cyclical industries. In 2024, Deere reported net income approaching $10 billion, a spectacular performance driven by strong agricultural commodity prices and robust construction activity. But the company projects net income between $5 and $5.5 billion for 2025, a significant decline reflecting agricultural market normalization as farmers reduce equipment purchases following several strong years. This revenue volatility isn't weakness. It's fundamental reality of serving industries where customer purchasing power depends on crop prices, construction activity, and broader economic conditions beyond any manufacturer's control. Deere manages this volatility through the diversification strategy discussed earlier, balancing agricultural exposure with construction and forestry operations that follow different economic cycles. The company also maintains flexible manufacturing capacity, adjusting production volumes to match demand rather than building inventory that sits unsold during downturns. Financial discipline learned through painful experiences during the 1980s farm crisis ensures Deere can survive lean years without threatening long-term viability. Deere's global footprint reflects decades of strategic international expansion, transforming the company from American manufacturer to genuine multinational corporation. Manufacturing facilities span the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Germany, France, India, China, and South Africa, producing equipment tailored to regional needs and preferences. European farmers prefer different tractor configurations than American farmers, with narrower profiles for smaller fields and different implement attachment standards reflecting regional agricultural practices. Chinese construction contractors demand equipment optimized for the country's massive infrastructure projects, with features and pricing appropriate for local market conditions. Indian farmers need compact, affordable equipment suitable for small family farms rather than the massive machines dominating American Midwest agriculture. Deere's international operations don't just export American designs. They develop region-specific products manufactured locally using supply chains optimized for each market. This localization strategy requires enormous investment and complexity but provides competitive advantages that pure exporters can't match, including faster response to regional customer needs, reduced currency exchange vulnerabilities, and better relationships with local governments and customers. The dealer network remains Deere's secret weapon, a competitive advantage that competitors struggle to replicate despite decades of trying. Approximately 1,500 John Deere dealers across North America and thousands more internationally provide sales, service, parts, and crucially, trusted local relationships that influence purchasing decisions. Farmers don't buy $250,000 combines based purely on specifications. They buy from dealers they trust, people who have served their families for generations, who understand their specific operations, and who will show up at 2 in the morning during harvest when equipment breaks down. Deere invests heavily in dealer support, providing training, diagnostic tools, parts logistics, and financial programs that enable dealers to serve customers effectively. This dealer network creates switching costs that protect Deere's market share. Farmers hesitate to buy competitors' equipment partly because they'd lose access to their trusted John Deere dealer relationships. Building comparable dealer networks requires decades and billions in investment, creating barriers to entry that protect Deere's position against new competitors. But the dealer network also creates tensions as equipment becomes increasingly digital and connected. When farmers can diagnose equipment problems remotely using smartphone apps and order parts directly from Deere's online platforms, what role do traditional dealers serve? When autonomous equipment operates with minimal human intervention, reducing the skilled labor that dealers traditionally provided, how do dealers remain economically viable? Deere faces the delicate challenge of modernizing distribution and service while preserving dealer relationships that remain strategically valuable. The company can't fully disintermediate dealers without destroying relationships and infrastructure that took generations to build. But it also can't ignore digital distribution opportunities that could reduce costs and improve customer experiences. Threading this needle requires sophisticated management balancing conflicting stakeholder interests while navigating toward an uncertain future where traditional business models may not survive. The sustainability imperative adds another layer of complexity and opportunity. Customers, investors, regulators, and public opinion increasingly demand that corporations demonstrate measurable progress on environmental sustainability, carbon emissions reduction, and climate change mitigation. Deere has committed to based emissions targets validated by the Base Targets Initiative, pledging to reduce Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 from a 2021 baseline and Scope 3 emissions 30% within the same timeframe. These aren't marketing promises. They're binding commitments requiring fundamental changes to manufacturing processes, supply chain management, product design, and corporate operations. Achieving these targets demands massive investments in renewable energy, manufacturing efficiency, sustainable materials, and product innovations like electric and alternative fuel powertrains that reduce emissions from equipment operations. The sustainability transformation creates competitive advantages for companies that execute effectively while imposing costs that squeeze margins and require difficult trade-offs between environmental goals and short-term profitability. So where does this leave the $43 billion giant in 2025? Dominant but not invulnerable, profitable but facing significant headwinds, technologically advanced but threatened by disruption, globally diversified but exposed to geopolitical risks, committed to sustainability but constrained by economic realities. The modern Deere bears almost no physical resemblance to John Deere's blacksmith shop, yet the core values remain surprisingly consistent. Solve real problems with superior engineering, never compromise quality for short-term gains, adapt relentlessly to changing conditions, and maintain genuine respect for the customers whose livelihoods depend on Deere equipment performing flawlessly. The machinery changed from polished steel plows to AI-guided autonomous tractors. The scale changed from one man forging individual implements to 83,000 employees operating globally. But the fundamental mission endures unchanged across 188 years. Help farmers feed the world, help contractors build infrastructure, help foresters manage resources sustainably, and do it all with equipment that works exactly as promised when customers need it most. That's the legacy worth $43 billion. 188 years separates the broke Vermont blacksmith salvaging a discarded saw blade from the $43 billion technology powerhouse commanding global markets in 2025. 188 years of continuous operation through wars, depressions, technological revolutions, and social transformations that destroyed countless competitors who couldn't adapt fast enough. 188 years during which a single simple idea, that polished steel could solve the prairie's impossible farming problem, evolved into autonomous tractors guided by satellites, AI-powered combines optimizing harvest in real time, and precision agriculture platforms managing billions of data points to feed a growing planet. The journey from 1837 to 2025 isn't just corporate history. It's a masterclass in survival through relentless innovation, a case study in maintaining core values while embracing radical change, and proof that companies built on solving real problems can endure across centuries if they never stop evolving. But let's strip away the corporate mythology and examine what actually made this longevity possible. Because plenty of companies dominated their industries in the 19th century only to disappear before the 20th ended. John Deere and Company survived not through luck or monopolistic advantages, but through a specific set of strategic decisions repeated consistently across generations of leadership. First, the company maintained fanatical obsession with quality, never allowing short-term profit pressures to compromise product reliability, even when competitors gained temporary market share through cheaper, inferior offerings. Second, Deere embraced technological disruption aggressively rather than defensively, acquiring the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company when tractors threatened to make plows obsolete, investing billions in precision agriculture when GPS and sensors promised to transform farming, and pioneering autonomous equipment when AI and machine learning emerged. Third, the company diversified strategically to reduce dependence on agriculture's brutal boom-bust cycles, expanding into construction equipment, forestry machinery, and turf care that generated revenue when agricultural markets collapsed. Fourth, Deere maintained genuine respect for customers, treating farmers, contractors, and foresters as partners whose feedback drove product development rather than as targets for extracting maximum revenue. These four principles, quality obsession, technological aggressiveness, strategic diversification, and customer respect, sound simple written as bullet points but demanded enormous discipline to maintain across nearly 2 centuries of leadership transitions, economic crises, competitive battles, and technological upheavals. Consider the pressure Deere's 19th-century leadership faced when thousands of competitors were flooding markets with cheaper plows. The easy choice was competing on price, cutting material costs and craftsmanship to match competitors' offerings. Deere chose the hard path, maintaining quality standards even when it meant slower growth and smaller margins, betting that reputation would eventually triumph over price competition. That bet paid off spectacularly, with Deere outlasting virtually all those thousands of competitors. Now consider the pressure Deere's 21st-century leadership faces from shareholders demanding maximum quarterly profits while simultaneously investing billions in autonomous technology, electric powertrains, and precision agriculture platforms that won't generate returns for years. The temptation to cut research spending, harvest short-term profits, and let future leadership worry about innovation must be overwhelming. Yet Deere continues investing in long-term technology development, prioritizing survival and relevance decades from now over maximizing this quarter's earnings. The legacy isn't measured purely in financial metrics, though $43 billion market capitalization and $50+ billion annual revenue certainly validate the business strategy. The real legacy lies in impact on civilization itself, specifically on humanity's ability to feed growing populations without destroying the planet. When John Deere forged his first self-scouring plow in 1837, global population stood at approximately 1.2 billion people. In 2025, 8 billion people inhabit Earth, and virtually all of them eat daily thanks partly to agricultural productivity improvements that Deere equipment helped enable. The self-scouring plow broke the prairie, transforming North America from food importer to breadbasket capable of feeding hundreds of millions. Deere's tractors replaced animal power, multiplying individual farmer productivity tenfold. Modern combines equipped with precision technology harvest crops with minimal loss, maximizing yields from every acre. Precision agriculture platforms optimize fertilizer, water, and pesticide applications, reducing environmental impacts while increasing productivity. This isn't abstract corporate achievement. It's fundamental infrastructure enabling human civilization at current scale. But the legacy also includes darker elements that honest assessment can't ignore. The same plows that broke the prairie enabled agricultural expansion that destroyed native ecosystems, displaced indigenous populations, and transformed diverse grasslands into monoculture commodity farms. The mechanization Deere pioneered eliminated millions of agricultural jobs, forcing massive rural-to-urban migration that hollowed out farming communities and concentrated populations in cities. The precision agriculture technologies generating efficiency gains also create dependencies and vulnerabilities, with farmers increasingly reliant on manufacturers' software platforms, subscription services, and proprietary diagnostic tools that previous generations never needed. Technology that delivers enormous benefits simultaneously imposes costs, trade-offs, and unintended consequences that complicate simplistic narratives about progress. John Deere's legacy includes both feeding billions and enabling agricultural practices that created significant environmental and social challenges still being addressed in 2025. The future remains uncertain in ways that should humble anyone tempted toward triumphalism about Deere's prospects. Climate change threatens agriculture fundamentally, with unpredictable weather patterns, shifting growing zones, and extreme events that could destabilize the farming-dependent revenue streams Deere relies upon. Autonomous equipment and AI risk commoditizing agricultural machinery, potentially reducing Deere to a hardware manufacturer competing primarily on price rather than integrated technology solutions. Geopolitical tensions threaten international operations, generating half of total revenue, with trade wars, tariffs, and nationalism potentially fragmenting the global markets Deere depends upon. Younger generations increasingly reject traditional farming, creating labor shortages and raising questions about who will operate equipment and purchase machinery when current farmers retire. Electric vehicles and alternative energy mandates could force expensive powertrain transitions that strain resources and disrupt production. Competition from Chinese manufacturers with government backing and lower cost structures threatens market share across multiple regions. None of these challenges are insurmountable, but neither are they trivial, and combinations of multiple simultaneous crises could overwhelm even the most adaptive corporations. Yet betting against Deere's survival seems foolish given the company's track record of navigating existential threats repeatedly across 188 years. The transition from animal power to tractors was existential. Deere survived by acquiring technology aggressively. The 1980s farm crisis was existential. Deere survived through diversification that reduced agricultural dependence. The digital revolution was potentially existential. Deere transformed into a technology company rather than remaining purely mechanical manufacturer. Climate change, geopolitical instability, and technological disruption represent serious threats, but they're threats Deere has encountered in various forms throughout its history. The company that survived the transition from hand-forged plows to precision agriculture guided by satellites probably possesses the adaptability to navigate whatever challenges the 21st century delivers. The key question isn't whether Deere will face crises. It's whether future leadership will maintain the quality obsession, technological aggressiveness, strategic diversification, and customer respect that enabled survival thus far. So what's the ultimate lesson from 188 years spanning broke blacksmith to $43 billion giant? Perhaps it's this: sustainable success requires simultaneously holding two contradictory truths. First, your core values and mission must remain absolutely unchanging, the non-negotiable principles that define who you are and why you exist. For Deere, that's solving customers' real problems with superior engineering and never compromising quality for short-term gains. Second, everything else must change constantly and radically in response to technological, competitive, and market evolution. The products change, the scale changes, the technology changes, the markets change, the organizational structures change. Companies that change everything, including core values, lose their identity and drift aimlessly. Companies that change nothing, preserving both values and methods, become obsolete and die. The secret is knowing what to hold sacred and what to abandon ruthlessly, maintaining that discipline across generations of leadership, and never confusing tradition with the unchanging principles that actually matter. John Deere, the man, died in 1886, having witnessed his experimental plow evolve into an industrial corporation dominating American agriculture. He never saw tractors, combines, construction equipment, forestry harvesters, GPS guidance, or autonomous machines. But he would absolutely recognize the values driving the corporation bearing his name: solve real problems, maintain obsessive quality standards, adapt relentlessly to changing conditions, and respect the customers whose livelihoods depend on your products performing flawlessly. The blacksmith who picked up a broken saw blade in desperate poverty would feel profound kinship with modern engineers developing AI algorithms and satellite guidance systems, because they're all fundamentally doing the same thing: helping people accomplish difficult work more effectively through superior tools. From 1837 to 2025, 188 years of continuous innovation in service of that simple mission. That's the legacy forged in steel, refined through competition, and proven across centuries. That's why the Leaping Deere logo still commands respect and trust from farmers, contractors, and foresters worldwide. And that's why betting against Deere's ability to navigate the next century seems as foolish as betting against that polished steel plow solving the prairie problem back in 1838. If this story of innovation, resilience, and transformation inspired you, make sure you're subscribed to Motor Chronicles because we dive deep into the untold histories of the titans who built the machines that shaped our modern world. Hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the dramatic, often surprising origins of the brands we rely on every day. The journey from broken saw blade to global empire proves that innovation born from desperation, combined with unwavering principles and relentless adaptation, can literally change the world. 188 years and counting. The legacy continues.